think you mentioned that the US has the greatest nuclear weapons arsenal. That in and of itself is not true. The Russians outpace the US by a margin, by a small one, but nevertheless.
We want to turn to President Donald Trump, who has directed military leaders in the US to resume testing nuclear weapons for the first time in over 30 years in order to try to keep up with competitors such as Russia and China. He made the announcement on Truth Social less than an hour before his meeting with President Xi of China in South Korea. Trump boasted that China came at a distant third compared to the amount and power of America's nuclear weapons arsenal. Let's speak to Darya Dolzikova, Senior Research Fellow on Proliferation and Nuclear Policy at RUSI, the defence think tank. Morning to you, Darya.
Good morning.
Good to speak to you. How significant is this from President Trump?
It's a little bit hard to say because, to be honest, it's a bit hard to read into what it is that he actually had in mind. The post that he put up on True Social has a number of different inaccuracies, both in terms of, I think he mentioned that the US has the greatest nuclear weapons arsenal. That in and of itself is not true. The Russians outpace the US by a margin, by a small one, but nevertheless. But his reference to nuclear testing is a little bit confusing because he mentions that he wants to do it sort of at, I don't remember the exact wording, but in line with or at the same pace, at the same rate as adversaries. Now, there haven't been any nuclear weapons tests except for by the North Koreans since the 1990s. I expect what he's thinking of is, and what he's responding to, are recent tests of nuclear-powered and nuclear-capable missiles by the Russians. There were 2 tests that have happened in the last week or so that have gotten a fair bit of attention because, you know, they can be potentially destabilizing, the systems that were tested. So I expect that's what he's referring to, but those tests did not include the testing of nuclear weapons. So it's a little bit unclear what he's actually talking about in that.
Yeah, he said,
post.
Yeah, the phrase was on an equal basis is what he wants to do with Russia and China. Mm-hmm. In theory, when could this happen? And how does this happen? How does a nuclear weapon get tested?
Yeah, so it would take quite some time for him to actually get the necessary approvals through the US system to get the US ready to test again if we're talking about atmospheric explosive nuclear testing. So that'll take some time kind of on the regulatory legislative side, but also in practice to set up the necessary measures to actually start testing nuclear weapons again would take some time. So this isn't something that they could turn around and do tomorrow. But again, it's not entirely clear what he's talking about. If he's talking about the testing of nuclear capable systems, nuclear capable missiles. The US does that already. The UK does that. So again, it's not entirely clear what he's referring to.
Right. Well, that's in some ways unsurprising, I suppose. Darya, thanks very much. Thank you for speaking with us. That is Darya Dolzikova, who is a Senior Research Fellow on Proliferation and Nuclear Policy at RUSI. I suppose the other part of this, Ben, is that it looks like there's some progress on trade between America and China. A 1-year trade truce appears to have been agreed. He is good when he gets in the room with other leaders. There are results.
He is, and also it's always that nervous thing if this could go one of two ways. Yes. And that's I read something this morning saying sort of governments and markets breathed a sigh of relief, and I think that's it. You know, we all saw him the first time in the White House with Zelensky, and then we saw them the second time, and it's so different, and it's like everything gets forgotten and it starts again. And this was the first time they'd met in 7 years. It was a long overdue meeting. He's been very spiky on China. Then he goes face to face, has a meeting, and actually he's sort of soft. And as you were playing at the top of the show, you know, that on the plane on the way back, telling reporters the conversation was a sort of 12 out of 10. But also what's interesting is that, you know, Taiwan wasn't mentioned. And he's very good. His people are very good. He's very good as well. You know, if he doesn't want to talk about it, he just doesn't.
Let's talk about President Trump, because he has said the US can sign a trade deal with China pretty soon after hailing a meeting with President Xi Jinping as a great success. He announced he'd lower tariffs on Chinese exports to 47% from 57% in exchange for a curb on the flow of fentanyl into the the US and China postponing export restrictions on rare earths. Well, let's go live to Washington and check in with Katie Balls, Washington editor for The Times. Hello to you, Katie. That meeting, President Trump rated it as 12 out of 10. Can you give us a little bit of context to that hugely flattering verdict in terms of substance?
Yeah, well, we know Donald Trump likes to be quite the showman in these interviews when he has these meetings. So, for example, the UK-US trade deal announced in the Oval Office, he said it was a done deal, it was amazing. And then, of course, we then found out that, it was really an agreement in principle. So he can have a sense of exaggeration at times. I think the truth is it was a fairly constructive meeting. We know that China and America have been, really at blows for months, really since the so-called Liberation Day when Donald Trump announced those tariffs, and China has really been at the forefront of those on the highest end, at one point 145%. So I think you can say both sides have almost taken their biggest weapons off the table and agreed some concessions, but it's still not clear really, whether this is a pause in hostilities or actually the road to a much better relationship, which will be permanent.
I mean, how does it fit broadly with Donald Trump's America First stance?
We've seen that he's heralded progress, for example, on soybeans as a big win for American farmers. So he's trying to say that things that they have agreed directly help the people of America in that sense. We also know that the US sees China as a major threat in terms of security, in terms of long-term geopolitical issues. So I think it is about wins economically for American consumers, American workers, American farmers, combining that obviously with balancing the long-scale challenges, which is, large parts of the Republican Party and the administration see China as a serious threat that, cannot be shrugged off through a trade deal.
Right, and he's also trailed future meetings between the two leaders. Let's turn to the race, the New York City mayoral race, because there's been an awful lot of attention on that election, and it's happening early next week. The front-runner Democrat nominee Zohran Mamdani is still out in front. Is it a foregone conclusion?
I think of the different races that we have next week, as you say, this is the one I think where Democrats feel it's the most foregone conclusion. Now, I think you should never say, and we know this from British and American politics, that anything is definite. Things can always change. There can always be surprises. But certainly Democrats think that this is, pretty much there. And actually, there are clearly some Democrats who look at this and they don't like that this is a result because, of course, it was a surprise that Mamdani, for some at least, won the nomination. And therefore, they're looking at, he was on the left of the party. There are some who, of course, are really enthusiastic for Mamdani and are really glad he has the nomination. But it is mixed feelings for the Democrat Party when it comes to Mamdani. You also have races in Virginia and New Jersey with Democrat candidates where the Democrats feel they could also have a victory.
Now, in terms of the other runners and riders in that New York race, how is it looking then for the former Governor Andrew Cuomo?
Well, in the polls, he is second behind Mamdani if we go on the polls. But of course, for Cuomo, he was really seen as the one to beat initially when it came to the Democrat nomination. And certainly the Democratic establishment was behind Cuomo. He had a lot of money behind him. And yet Mamdani won that nomination. And you can speak to failures in his campaign, but I also think it speaks to how perhaps US politics and politics in general is changing. Social media, a grassroots campaign, foot soldiers, and just enthusiasm for a candidate, beating the more traditional forms in terms of, lots of money, editorial endorsements and things. Mamdani cut through in that sense. So it's not impossible Cuomo, does better than some expected, does worse. But certainly, I think this story really for the Democratic Party is if Mamdani, as expected, wins, and obviously, of course, after winning the Democratic nomination, what does that mean for the future of the Democratic Party in America? Will it mean that candidates like AOC, the Congresswoman,
yes,
have more enthusiasm behind them going forward than perhaps the more middle of the road Democrats?
Right. Do you think there is likely to be a shift then in the wake of a Mamdani victory? I mean, are Democrats nervous about that? Or is it a one-off? It is New York and it won't necessarily mean a wholesale move to the left.
I think there will be a battle of ideas, and I think there will be a debate within the party. And I interviewed James Carville, the Clinton strategist, for my Sunday Times column about this, and he was saying, look, there's going to be a candidate from every wing of the party, there's going to be a lot of different discussions, and we're not going to know the future direction until we have that candidate, and because they will set it out. And of course, there is no leader of the opposition in American politics, which means often it feels a bit of the Democrats are slightly at sea when we see these things, because they don't have a clear one voice coming out. But certainly if Mandani does win, I think it will infuse, the Bernie Sanders, the AOC, the Stop the Oligarchy tool, that type of wing of the party that wants to almost have a more populist approach to its politics, but one on the left, and be the kind of the anti-establishment party of the left. And I think they will have a sense of energy bouncing off on this. Now, if they can make that a sustainable one, that's a different question, but I think it will boost them in that sense.
Now, what about Kamala Harris? Because she has hinted that she may run again. What's been the reaction to that?
I wouldn't say it's universally popular, her comments to the BBC. I think ever since she had her book out, there's been a guessing game amongst Democrats, which is she really, on manoeuvres, thinking about another tilt at the White House, or is she just trying to, in a way, build on from the public profile of her last job in the campaign and make some money for a book. And the book was so critical, actually, of some of her Democrat colleagues that perhaps it was more the second. Now it is clear that she does feel she has unfinished business. If you look at some polls in terms of Democrat candidates, she is quite out. She doesn't do too badly. I think she does lead on some of them. But of course, she currently has the biggest profile because of what just happened. So I don't think we're at a point where we can really compare her with other potential candidates like Wes Moore, for example, just given she has so much more name recognition than some of the perhaps more rising stars who could come through as time goes on. So I think that there will be some who will get behind her, but there's certainly obviously think that she had her chance, and they need to move past the Biden-Harris era to really work out how the Democrats are going to get that path back from the wilderness.
Katie Ball's great to talk to you, Washington editor for The Times.